Mark Twain popularized the saying that there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. This phrase was then used a bajillion times in order to discredit both valid and invalid research and statistics, which in turn lowered the credibility of the phrase itself, in addition to lowering the credibility of research and statistics in the minds of the commoners. Nevertheless, in the current year, the Cathedral Media insists on proving once again that Mr. Twain might have been onto something after all, as misuse of statistics is an integral part of the process that is scientific lying. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so I've been postponing this video for several months now because initially I thought about making the video a very long one with detailed, long-winded explanations and classifications, but then I would realize that that would be more appropriate for a handbook or something rather than a YouTube video. Well, there's that, and then there's also the fact that too much theory becomes boring after a certain point, and most of it can be easily explained by more examples rather than theoretical posturing. So, let's try to keep the theory part very short and focus more on examples. Now, there are many ways through which the Cathedral Media, as well as pundits, political operatives, religious leaders, and anyone with an agenda, really, lies to you through statistics, but there are 5 common ways through which it is done: appeal to ignorance, appeal to jargon, cherry-picked data, OPAC methodology, and framing. The last one is usually seen in the Cathedral Media more than in the statistics themselves, while the other 4 are sins that can come from any direction. Now, keep in mind that sometimes these can emerge without intention. Researching stuff takes time, takes knowledge, and takes a lot of wisdom too. And none of those are easily available or easy to come by, especially now in a 24-hour news cycle when everyone is looking for the next viral piece of news or data, while calmly researching stuff and coming out with an explanation days or even weeks after the event is just out of fashion, at least for now. It may come back. Nevertheless, with few exceptions, all 5 of these sins can be counteracted with asking the following 4 questions, not necessarily in this order. Compared to what? How do you define X? X being the topic being discussed. How was the data gathered? And perhaps the most important one, does this coincide with the real-life observations of your own or anyone you've ever known? The last one is very important in certain cases when claims are pretty outrageous. Now, I can already hear the rigorous statisticians and other peeps obsessed with this type of with this kind of thing typing that, oh man, things can be true even if you've never observed them, you know. Well, yes and no. It really does depend on the claim. Let me give you an example. For instance, if someone had told me there were 150 bar fights in my hometown in 2019, I should be tempted to lean towards believing the claim, since it is entirely possible that 150 bar fights took place in my hometown over a year. There are at least 2,000 bars in this town, so 150 fights in a year, yeah, that sounds entirely plausible. However, if someone were to tell me there were 20,000 bar fights in this town in 2019 or 200,000 bar fights in this town, well, that's when the last question becomes relevant. At 20,000 bar fights, it would statistically mean I should know at least one person who was either involved or witnessed at least 1 or 2 of these fights. So yeah, that's why the last question is so important. Okay, so let's take every one of these 5s, describe it a bit, and then provide one or two examples. As usual, I don't pretend this video is comprehensive or definitive, nor do I claim to know everything about everything. I just claim to know a few things. So, number one, appeal to ignorance. Now, in the dictionary of logical fallacies, appeal to ignorance is when one makes the case that the conclusion is true because there is no evidence against it, thus essentially shifting the burden of proof in such a way that makes it impossible to argue because proving negatives is almost always impossible. Appeal to ignorance in the field of statistics or communicating statistics has a more literal sense, namely the suggestion or the reliance that the subject is or should be ignorant. The most recent example I've seen of this particular sin is in the Cathedral Media's reporting of Swedish cities resembling more with Baghdad or Beirut rather than what one would typically think of when thinking about a city in Europe. The Guardian, for instance, reporting on the ever-increasing number of bomb attacks in Sweden, also insists to tell us that, quote, despite the gang attacks, Sweden's murder rate has fallen since the 1990s and remains among the world's lowest, with killings linked to domestic violence, hate crime and spontaneous fight all significantly down, close quote. This kind of framing relies on the fact that most readers don't know that Sweden has a special way of recording crime. For instance, it is easy to say killings linked to domestic violence are down when the definition of domestic violence is broad. When domestic violence is defined as intentional physically violent acts, then you get one number. When it is defined in such a way that even telling your spouse, no, we're not spending $1,000 on your whims, and yes, I'm serious, that's financial abuse and a form of domestic violence in many European countries, including Sweden. So when you define it like that, you'll get a different number in terms of the rate of death from domestic violence, and that number will for sure be lower. And then there is the reliance of The Guardian, and not just The Guardian. This dubious claim has been repeated by the BBC, Deutsche Welle and others. But they all rely on the general ignorance of the reader who most likely doesn't know or doesn't care to look it up on Brottsförebyggande website to learn more. Here's a graph with Sweden's crime rate since the 70s. As you can all see, murder rate has been pretty flat. But overall, the crime rate is hardly going down. Quite the opposite, I would say. Now here's a graph from 2002 till 2018 with the absolute number of what the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention calls confirmed cases of lethal violence. Dark green is all cases, purple is women victims, and light green is men victims. So in other words, putting such a passage in a story about bomb attacks is an appeal to ignorance, because the story about the bomb attacks is not about killings, but one about soaring crime rate. So selecting only the murder rate, which again has been flat since the 70s, relies on the ignorant reader to fill in the blanks with a narrative that is quite far away from the truth. Now, isn't that particularly nice? Here's another example, also from Sweden. The left-wing publication Aftonbladet, in an effort to hate on President Trump, compared the murder rate of Malmö with the murder rate of Chicago in an attempt to show that Sweden is not as dangerous as President Trump claimed. Well, that's interesting, except it's hardly an apples-to-apples comparison. Malmö is a small city of no more than 400,000 people. Chicago is at least 6 times bigger and with a history so radically different that the two might be on different planets. Sure, it may make Swedish leftists feel good that they're not as bad as the American leftists at running cities, but a more honest comparison is with similarly sized cities in Europe, preferably Nordic cities. Now, Malmö has a homicide rate of 3.4 per 100,000 people, according to Aftonbladet. Well, Nottingham, which in 2006 was billed as the most dangerous city in the UK, had a 2.7-ish murder rate back then. Today it's around 2.5 and stable, while other types of crime have been increasing. Nottingham is about the same population size as Malmö. and with similar laws when it comes to guns and explosives. Utrecht in the Netherlands is also about the same size as Malmö, yet its homicide rate is below the national average, and the national average in the Netherlands is 0.9 per 100,000 people. You get the point. By comparing with Chicago, Aftonbladet relied on the ignorance of the reader, who is expected not to ask about how Malmö compares with similarly sized cities that are geographically and historically closer to Sweden than Chicago has ever been. Now, this is pretty common anyway. Number 2, appeal to jargon. This one is usually done by agenda-driven researchers rather than by the media. The media, however, is guilty of never asking the questions and just uncritically report the so-called findings, especially if it fits their narrative. This particular sin is found in many areas where statistics are quoted, but I encountered it the most in discussions concerning sexual politics, particularly statistics regarding sexual violence, sexual assault, rape, domestic violence, and so on and so forth. What I mean by that is the 1 in 5 women or 1 in 4 type of statistics. Almost all of them complete and utter lies. I will leave some links in the low bar with further explanations, including digging up tables and detailed explanations on why the reported numbers are nonsense. But for the purpose of illustrating the appeal to jargon, I'll give the stat that allegedly shows that 1 in 5 college women will experience sexual assault during their college experience. That is one of those outrageous claims that warrants that non-scientific question that I suggested at the beginning of the video, namely, does this come anywhere near close enough to your observation or the observation of anyone you've ever known? To which the response can only be, no, absolutely not. Because if such a stat were true, then it would mean that an American campus is less safe than most war zones. But the way this figure became reality was via agenda-driven researchers who appealed to jargon, specifically feminist jargon. You see, for normal people and the law, sexual assault as a term, it has a meaning. For starters, an event in order to be qualified as sexual assault, it has to at the very least qualify as assault to begin with. In the la land, that is agenda-driven feminist research, which churns out these numbers, sexual assault has such broad definitions that it might as well be a meme itself. For instance, in the 1 in 5 statistic, there are included students who had a perfectly consensual sexual encounter with someone after that someone expressed displeasure or criticized their appearance. Similarly, students who've had a beer or two before engaging in perfectly consensual sexual activity are counted as victims of sexual assault, but only if they're women. All of that is due to the fact that the researchers are using an ideological lens to classify the responses. And in the feminist jargon, everything is rape. Now, to be fair, sometimes it's not the researchers who do this, but those who report on the research. I'll leave a link in the low bar with an article from the Huffington Post, of all places, lambasting the New York Times, a former newspaper, precisely for using 1 in 5 when in reality the research they're reporting on did not in fact support such a conclusion. In that case, the former newspaper was the agenda-driven party more so than the researchers themselves. And in some cases, both the researchers and the media are agenda-driven and collude to mislead the public. One such case is the infamous Gender-Based Violence Eurobarometer, a survey produced by the European Commission which somehow manages to produce results that make even the staunchest Euro-fanatics to slowly back away from endorsing it because it's just too insane. For instance, back in 2016, they produced this map which purported to show that most of Eastern Europe, as well as Belgium and France, are essentially pro-rape. The map went viral and militant misandrists ran wild with it. Now, just from looking at the legend of the map, some things become obvious, such as the weird thresholds from 0 to 21, 22 to 29, 30 to 37, and 38 to 100. That in itself is quite a weird way of dividing the data, especially when you look at some neighboring countries. According to this map, 22% of UK respondents indicated at least one reason in which non-consensual sex is justified, while 21% of Irish respondents said the same. Yet on the map, they appear as being polar opposites. This isn't by accident, mind you. The way this is grouped is in itself agenda-driven. If one digs further into the PDF, and you'll have the links in the low bar to check for yourself, one will notice that the only reason that got relatively high approval rate was not clearly saying no. All the other reasons got very low approval rating both in the red countries and in the blue ones. But the standard applied by the researchers is an agenda-driven one, where you're supposed to believe the self-identified victim at all times and ask no questions. Whereas, as it turns out, significant minorities in Europe still think that one should say no and make it clear that one doesn't want to engage in sexual activity. Then there's the issue of phrasing of the question, leaving it unclear whether the interviewee is asked about the opinions of others or one's own. All of this is basically appeal to jargon. An academic perfectly understands these subtleties, but most of the rest of the populace doesn't. So as a result, there's free rein on both the academics and the Cathedral Media to play with your mind using numbers and maps that appear sound, but don't hold up even to the most basic scrutiny. Number 3. Cherry-picked data. Now, this one used to be the go-to method of lying via statistics until about 25 years ago, when agenda-driven research became the absolute norm and thus made it rather obsolete on the supply side. However, on the demand side, there's still plenty of practice to go around. Cherry-picked data means that someone on the chain, be it the media, the researcher, or the one paying for the research, is intentionally putting aside data that contradicts his narrative. Now, sometimes this can be unintentional, but usually it is. Now, this can mean intentionally select interviews with people more likely to be of your opinion. This is done routinely by CNN, for instance, when they do their political projections, which is why they've been so wrong so often lately. But this can also mean simply discounting data points that you don't like. For instance, if your goal is to tell the truth, you will say that Ireland is richer than Norway with a GDP per capita adjusted for purchase power parity at $78,785 as of 2018, compared to Norway, which in the same year stood at only $74,356. However, you won't see that quoted too often, because most of the media is interested in presenting to plebs a narrative about the greatness of the Nordic model, so they'll do their best to avoid the purchase power parity and instead go with the nominal GDP, which of course will run higher because that's the point of the nominal GDP, to simply count the shekels without adjusting for reality. The other way around can be done too. For instance, in terms of per capita wealth, Canada is poorer than the United States. That's just a fact. But how much poorer? Well, if you want to exaggerate your claim, you will quote the nominal GDP per capita, which leaves Canada more than $16,000 behind the US per capita. If you want to be accurate, you will instead use the PPP numbers, which put Canada only $12,000 behind their American friends. If you want to downplay the difference, you can go rogue by saying that Canada has a much better Gini coefficient and a slightly higher Human Development Index than the United States, which means that actually quality of life is better because more equality, sir. Throw in some free healthcare in there in the mix, and there you have an argument that you'll often hear from the left-wing publications. It's all nonsense, of course, but it's scientific nonsense via statistics and cherry-picking of data. And don't underestimate the willingness and the gullibility of the plebs to believe it. I meet at least 2 or 3 such believers every week, and dismantling the lie is pretty complicated because it's hard to explain to people how they're not seeing the whole picture. Not to mention, it's even harder to explain to people that the persons they trust, be it news anchors or friends, or the institutions with authority, are indeed wrong, no matter how convincing they might sound. And it's not just in matters of economics. I mean, cherry picking is common in all areas where statistics are being used, and it's clearly more prevalent in activist groups. Just as we're speaking, climate change alarmist groups are very busy in propagating cherry-picked statistics in order to further their alarmist, albeit false, narrative. You will see plenty of articles in the Cathedral Media quoting record attendance at the Fridays for the Future or similar events put out by the Greta cult. But they'll never tell you that the record is compared to the norm of their events, and the norm is usually participants in the single digits. And that's because without on-the-field legwork to rent a mob, the Greta cult has statistically zero grassroots support. Nobody believes the claptrap, and without some incentive, be it money or excuses to skip school, nobody willingly attends these marches. Strictly in terms of statistics, this is most easily diffused by simply asking, compared to what? Oftentimes, if you're dealing with an honest interlocutor, this will prompt a lot of questions that eventually move the discussion outside of the cherry-picked bubble. If you're dealing with an activist, then you know the drill. If there is an audience, you provide the answers and frame the argument that the activist is insane. If there is no audience, then don't engage, because the activist is not there to be persuaded. In fact, oftentimes activists, at least the professional ones, already know your arguments and may indeed agree with you, but they'll never admit that in public because their job depends on it. And I'm very serious about this. Most people don't realize just how many professional activists exist out there whose purpose is not to argue, but to propagandize and forward narratives. And they get a paycheck for that too, which, by the way, is the reason why the left has been winning so often. They're willing to put their money into this. The right, not so much. Too many right-wingers still seriously believe that having paid shills is beneath them. Well, tough luck then. Anyway, that's a topic for another time. I really should do a video about the opportunity, efficiency, and relevance, as well as the degrees between paid shills. That's quite an interesting topic in itself. Yeah, someday I'll do that too. Number 4, OPAC methodology. This one is pretty self-explanatory. It's the situation when it is impossible to learn how the data that led to the conclusion you're questioning was gathered and processed. This is routinely the case in political polls or surveys that have a political connotation. Also, OPAC methodology can also mean when the methodology itself is not secret, but it's very hard to find it out. It's either behind a paywall or outright restricted to only a class of people, usually academics, while the results and implications are free to be shoved down the throats of the plebs. One recent example I can think of is the survey widely publicized in the left-leaning media and thoroughly debunked by Breitbart. I think I might have given the link to that article a few videos ago. Anyway, the survey/study titled Transgender Exclusion from the World of Dating, Patterns of Acceptance and Rejection of Hypothetical Trans Dating Partners as a Function of Sexual and Gender Identity, in which the authors basically argue that being heterosexual is tantamount to being a militant racist. Your dislike of the female penis is basically no different from the cross-burning Klan, you know? But anyway, beyond the opinions of the extremist leftist authors of the paper, their survey also made sweeping claims that no reasonable person could ever entertain, such as the claim that 3.1% of straight men and women would be willing to date transgender people, and that 45% of the sexual minorities would be willing to do the same. This was uncritically reported and accepted in the progressive media because getting to the methodology is hard. Well, it used to be hard until a Kazakh lady decided several years ago that research should be public since it almost always consumes taxpayers' money. So that's how I found the methodology. Let me read you from the methodology. Quote, The majority of participants identified as cisgender women, 61.1%, followed by cisgender men, 37.1%, trans women 0.7%, non-binary 0.7%, and trans men 0.4%. For the majority of analyses, gender was assessed inclusively, such that trans men were included with cisgender men and trans women were included with cisgender women. However, where relevant, we also separated participants by gender identity in order to more closely examine how gender identity may be associated with response patterns. Participants ranged in age from 18 to 81, with a mean age of 25.51. The majority of participants resided in Canada or the US. At the time of participating in the study, most participants were in some form of a dating relationship or were single. Roughly half of the sample identified as non-religious, and the majority of participants did not yet have a university degree, although 56.2% of the sample was currently enrolled in a university. Participants also indicated their self-reported sexual identities, with 24.4% indicating gay or lesbian, 63.5% heterosexual, and 12.2% indicating bisexual, queer, or two-spirit, close quote. Translation: that's why the methodology is behind the paywall and never openly discussed in the Cathedral Media. Well, except Breitbart, I guess, since Breitbart now has NewsGuard certification and it's essentially part of the Cathedral Media now. Anyway, seriously, if the methodology had been more widely reported on, then this survey would have long ended up where it belongs, into the trash bin, because it's not representative of anything. Only in the world of Tumblr would it be believable that 12% of the population is two-spirit and that 50% of the populace is non-religious, or that the mean age is 25. That may be true in Egypt or Lesotho, but not in the United States or Canada. And that's why it's important, whenever you're being given an outrageous claim and a fancy link to a study to back that up, to ask about the methodology. With very few exceptions, there's almost always something really wrong in the methodology. And this problem has become endemic, which is why there is a huge, albeit rarely noticeable in public, but it's a huge scandal inside the academe precisely because of this. Methodologies, particularly in social sciences, have become so biased and so out of touch with reality that one doesn't even have to be that bright anymore to notice the problems. So yeah, to sum up this point, always read the fine print and always pay attention to the methodology. If you can't get access to the methodology, then maintain high degrees of skepticism until further notice. Okay, finally, number 5, framing. Now, this is almost always a compared to what question, or more precisely, an aspect where that question is avoided at all costs. As I said at the beginning, this one is almost exclusive to the media, and the examples are plentiful. Take, for instance, the claim that 9 in 10 rapes go unreported, which I found in this nice article from The Telegraph. Well, compared to what? In order to establish that X% of something happen or does not happen, you need to know what the 100% is. So if you have 1,000 elements of which 900 are blue and 100 are red, then you can say that 9 in 10 elements are blue, because you know both the absolute number of blue elements, 900, and the total number of elements, which you're comparing to, which is 1,000. But in the claim about rape, you don't know either. You don't know either the absolute number of unreported rapes nor the total number. You only know what's reported, and even that is quite sketchy, as the same report also mentions that 10% of the reports are outright false and then another 10% might be false. So there is no reasonable way one can say how many rapes go unreported. Now, common sense dictates that there are surely instances that go unreported, but also common sense dictates that they're probably not 90% of the instances. Here's another example. 1 in 4 homeless people are women. That's a classic example of dishonest framing in order to focus on the marginal aspect of the problem rather than the problem itself being homelessness. Variations of this include essentially all narratives about violence against women, which in reality is a marginal issue. The vast majority of victims of violence are men. The pinnacle of dishonesty in terms of framing is the media-driven term femicide, which you will hear more often than you should in various newspapers and sources, even though, again, it is a rather marginal phenomenon, given that essentially nowhere on earth are women more likely to be victims of murder. No, not even in the harsh Islamic theocracies. This kind of framing is toxic because the only people who benefit from it are those who get paid to produce more toxic framing like this. Everyone else, including the female victims, are left the same or worse off. And it's not just... Jesus Christ. It's not just sexual politics. I mean, let's take another example. Take, for instance, the claim that the American police is out there to shoot black people. The way it is supported is to take the claims from identitarian activist groups like Black Lives Matter and broadcast them uncritically. Speaking of cherry-picking, the claim keeps on shifting as more and more researchers take them seriously, investigate them, and conclude that they're garbage, because they are. Initially, the claim was that the police shoots mostly black men, period. Then, when it came out that in fact the police shoots mostly white people, the claim changed to one adjusted for the proportion of the population. Now, a new study shows that that's very likely untrue as well. But even without the study, the framing issue still remains, namely that almost nobody in the media will give you the full context. Like, the fact that about 4% of the US population, that is to say black men aged 15 to 60, gives more than 50% of the murderers. So it does stand to reason that this population subgroup is most likely to have encounters with the police, and yes, that includes deadly encounters too. And again, just like with sexual politics, the toxic framing by the media helps exactly nobody. It sure doesn't help young black men, it exacerbates animus in society, and prevents honest debate. Toxic framing can be found in news about economics too. For instance, recently the non-economic press beat the drum quite a lot that there is no recession in Germany, and saying otherwise is just lunacy. The economics press was a bit more nuanced. Business Insider, for instance, titled, "Germany just narrowly avoided recession, but a downturn is more likely than not in 2020. But even that is a little bit dishonest, because it discounts almost all of the recent economic data, which shows Germany already in recession for quite a few months now. And all of that is discounted in favor of the cooked numbers by the federal government, which quite amusingly wants you to believe there's some sort of gods who can calculate everything in such a complex system, which is the German economy, and end up with the conclusion that the German economy grew by exactly 0.1% in the third quarter, and therefore there is no recession. And the media plays along with this by framing the argument that only data from the federal government matters, while all the private banks, all the business surveys, all the data from the manufacturing sector, which is, the largest economic sector in Germany, all of that is just marginal noise. Der Staat knows best. Well, that's toxic framing. It helps nobody, and it could end up harming other countries of Europe too. All for what? So dictator Merkel can go out of scene while the economy is still technically not terrible? Anyway, the point is that dishonest framing is all too present in the Cathedral Media, and as a result, you should always try to get to primary sources when they feed you numbers, and once you get to those primary sources, always ask the relevant questions. You'd be surprised how often the Cathedral reports misleading data and sometimes outright falsehoods. And it's not always the case that it's with bad intentions, though of course sometimes it is. Stupidity, incompetence, or simply laziness are much more common factors. In fact, there is some evidence that the journalist's moral reasoning simply is lower now than a decade ago. Now, that may be just a reflection of the wider society. The point is that you should approach this in a more relaxed manner. Not everyone is out there to intentionally lie to you. Most of them are just, dumb and lazy. And yeah, I guess that's it. One final point that I should make is that just because manipulation via statistics happens, that is not in itself a reason not to use statistics. The reverse is also true. Just because some source of authority uses statistics, that doesn't mean there is no manipulation, either intentional or unintentional. Just keep calm, ask more questions, and watch as activists squirm. They really don't like it when you mock their bollocks studies. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous financial support. Please consider giving a shekel if you derive any value from the work being done here. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website, freedomalternative.com, particularly the library section. And I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.